Every morning, Camilla woke up before the sun came out. The small room she rented barely allowed her to have a mattress, an old chair, and a small wooden table where she prepared her diluted coffee. From the age of 17, I worked as a housekeeper for families who barely recognized me. The life I led consisted of a routine of effort, household chores, and watching for the brightness of each space, all without receiving the attention it deserved. Camilla's mother claimed that work gave her dignity. However, for Camilla, her dedication barely allowed her to survive. Daily, for 40 minutes, I walked the path to an immense residence in the urban outskirts, a majestic building with marble floors and lamps that swung like stars at the top. In that place, she worked tirelessly, passing unnoticed in an environment other than hers. Her hands, rough and with cracks, showed the time invested in improving the lives of others. In contrast, the palace belonged to Rodrigo Torres. At 31, Rodrigo had managed to consolidate himself as a successful magnate and billionaire, thanks to his tireless dedication in the building sector. His imposing stature, his distinguished bearing, and his penetrating gaze, even after high-end sunglasses, imposed respect to all those present. He believed that the world revolved around him, or at least, that was what he thought. In his exclusive office, from where the entire city was divided, millionaire agreements were made, and determinations that transformed destinies were adopted. However, the residence in which he lived showed his isolation. There are no images hanging on the walls, nor is any welcoming feeling perceived in the environment. Rodrigo saw life as a continuous battlefield, considering relationships as simple entertainment. He had always characterized himself as a man centered on reality. The solution to everything went through the formalization of contracts and agreements. Individuals were mere pawns in his strategy, even among his closest friends, who used to feel envious of his achievements. They mocked his lack of maturity. Camilla and Rodrigo's lives are completely opposite. She was content with what she earned, living justly in terms of accommodation and food, unlike him, who amassed fortunes without knowing how to enjoy them. While he trusted the kindness of others, he valued his utility more. However, destiny, in its arbitrariness, makes no difference between wealthy people and humble people. Suddenly, everything turned into a normal day. While doing his daily chores, Camilla was in charge of keeping the main room impeccable with its characteristic stealth. Upon entering, Rodrigo walked with determination and watched her closely, not with the derisive attitude that he used to show to his colleagues, but with a curious interest. He asked her a surprising question. "Have you ever considered taking the step towards marriage?" Surprised, Camilla released the cloth she had in her hand. Suddenly, her heart jumped in her chest. She thought Rodrigo was laughing at her. However, he showed an imperturbable expression. "I can't understand, sir," she replied, feeling anxious. Rodrigo moved to a leather sofa, took off his glasses, and watched her closely. "It's simple. I'm looking for marriage. You look like a person you can trust. I prefer to maintain formal relationships and avoid getting emotionally involved." For Camilla, that seemed like something out of a dream. What kind of man would ask his worker to marry him? However, Rodrigo did not give the impression of being making a joke. That night, it was impossible for him to reconcile the dream. Although the proposal was excessive, it was also attractive. The mother used to say that sometimes life presented complicated challenges to understand. A few days later, Camilla gave her consent. Her desire was not out of ambition, but because something inside her longed to believe that she had the potential to transcend and not just be an unimportant figure in the lives of others. The nuptial celebration was intimate and somewhat distant. Rodrigo only extended the invitation to a lawyer and 2 witnesses, without including anyone else. Camila wore a modest white dress that a friend lent her. The moment the words were spoken, I said yes, I accept. The news of the curious link quickly spread among Rodrigo's relatives and friends. In select places and exclusive meetings, his friends used to joke. Rodrigo Torres, a man of great influence, is in marriage to a housekeeper. Rodrigo did not even bother to correct them. He did not care about the opinion of others. However, for Camila, every time they looked at her with mockery or made a malicious comment, he perceived it as a burden on his back. He tried to hide it, but his gaze revealed the suffering. In the big house, the silence became even denser. Rodrigo was reserved in his words, while Camila used to spend lonely afternoons in a corner of the garden. Despite living in a luxurious environment today, her heart was still without content. Without prior knowledge, that marriage link would initiate an unexpected change for everyone, even for Rodrigo, who had not anticipated it. The days after the wedding passed like an optical illusion. Despite being now Mrs. Torres, Camila continued to experience the same feeling of when she was just an employee. The big residence, with its unoccupied rooms and endless corridors, was in absolute silence. Every day, at dawn, he woke up early, as if his body had not assimilated yet, that he did not have to continue with the cleaning routine. He wore simple outfits, picked up his hair in a braid, and walked around the house. As for Rodrigo, he followed his routine faithfully without changes. At dawn, he left dressed impeccably, and at nightfall, he returned, with the seeming fatigue of someone determined to achieve success at all costs. They barely exchanged brief conversations. While he enjoyed his food alone in his office, Camila dined next to a window, contemplating the lights of the city in the distance. That afternoon, Rodrigo returned home before usual. In the backyard, Camila took care of a small, careless rose that she had discovered among the vegetation. Despite having suffered scratches on her hands due to thorns, she continued to work with dedication. From the glass door, Rodrigo looked at her in silence, with a frown. The image of a woman kneeling on the floor, covered with a modest jersey and skirt, collided fully with the impeccable elegance of the mansion. At last, with an imperious voice, he inquired, "Why are you here?" When he looked up, Camila observed him with a certain fear. She did not usually receive his words without any reason. I observed these withered flowers. I considered that with attention, they could give flowers again. He answered while standing up and drying his hands on the cloak. Rodrigo laughed sarcastically and derisively. Without waiting for a reply, he expressed, "You became my wife to take care of the roses." He turned his back and left. A knot formed in Camila's chest. The humble and affectionate gesture he had was ignored, as many other times in his existence. He returned to the room. Despite being the only owner of the house, he was never considered the legitimate owner of any space, and closed the door gently. On that occasion, he did not taste a bite. She perceived that for Rodrigo, she was nothing more than an inanimate object, something that could go unnoticed according to her desire. In the following days, Camila began to notice small peculiarities about Rodrigo that went unnoticed to others. He punctually observed his watch every hour and avoided taking a seat in the main dining room, as if it were painful for him to contemplate the large, unoccupied table. Sometimes, he heard him walking from one end to the other of his office at midnight, like someone disturbed by a dilemma without a solution. However, he never allowed anyone to discover his vulnerable points. Rodrigo Torres's armor was unrivaled. One Saturday morning, Rodrigo took it by surprise in the kitchen. While I was about to make a modest breakfast, I opted for coffee and slices of toast bread. Without warning, he suddenly appeared, wearing an informal outfit. Something unusual in his style. He inquired in a neutral way, because he did not ask the chef to do it. Camila raised her shoulders in a sign of indifference. I am not used to someone doing the tasks in my place. I also enjoy preparing dishes in the kitchen. After a brief moment of silent contemplation, Rodrigo sat down on the bar and took a slice of toast bread from the tray. With surprise, Camila gave him a look of bewilderment. I had never seen him taste a meal made by her before. Rodrigo commented that your life is quite simple, showing more interest than disdain. Maybe, but sometimes it is the simple things that have the highest price. He answered gently without looking at her. Rodrigo chose not to answer. He finished his breakfast and left. However, this time he chose to place the plate on the bar instead of just leaving it there. For Camila, that act, despite being tiny, represented a vulnerability in her protection. That afternoon, a group of Rodrigo's friends suddenly appeared. Individuals with brand clothes and hollow carcasses flooded the residence with an atmosphere that seemed almost aggressive. From her room, Camila stayed listening to the laughter coming from afar. "What about your lady, Rodrigo?" One of the men joked loudly, asking if she was not going to be introduced. Rodrigo observed them with a serious gesture, something unusual in his behavior. Leaving everyone surprised, he mentioned that Camila was not a person to show off. She is a person worthy of respect. After that uncomfortable moment, Rodrigo decided not to do anything to break the silence. He experienced, for the first time, having protected something that he considered more relevant than his prestige. Every word was listened to carefully by Camila. She experienced an intense blush on her cheeks, a product of the shame and fury she kept inside. At that moment, she realized that for Rodrigo, she was not his partner, but simply an element to cover a gap in his existence. When night came, at the moment when the house was quiet again, Camila decided to go out to the garden. Kneeling under the starry firmament, he leaned down next to the withered roses and began to excavate the earth manually. "Valor resides in simple things," he whispered in a low voice, as if trying to persuade himself. From the window of the second floor, Rodrigo looked at her again without being seen by her. He could not understand that lady or the reason for his discomfort when he saw her in that state. Vulnerable, but firm at the same time. What was clear was that something in his life was beginning to transform, although he was still not sure what it was. The dim light of dawn illuminated the lady's house. At dawn, Camila got up as usual, before the rest of the house, and went to the backyard. The roses, to which he had attended with care, began to show tiny green sprouts. Although for some people it lacked importance, for her it represented a ray of hope. In my experience, I have understood that the positive needs its time to fully develop. While he was pruning dry branches, he perceived footsteps on his back. He turned around and found Rodrigo standing, with his hands in the pockets of his gray suit, looking at her with an enigmatic expression. "Again for these lares?" he inquired without showing disapproval, simply with interest. "It is inevitable for me," Camila, with serenity in her gaze, explained that the plants are not in a hurry to grow, but with dedication they get it. Rodrigo looked at her for a few additional moments. Then, in silence, he went to the nearby stone seat and settled in it. That took him by surprise. He had never shown interest in staying by his side. Camila returned to concentrate on her work, trying to ignore his presence. Suddenly, breaking the silence, he asked why you had agreed to marry him. In an instant, Camila interrupted his step and directed her gaze towards him. The question took me by surprise, since I thought it had a special meaning. maybe I could consider a change. He answered honestly. I consider that all people deserve to have the possibility of finding happiness. A bitter smile was drawn on Rodrigo's face. Camila, do you have faith in the existence of happiness? Indeed, it is not something that is received as a gift, but it is found in the simplest details, in a home, in a family, he expressed delicately. When he heard the word family, Rodrigo frowned. He suddenly incorporated himself into the seat, as if the words had been fire on him. He responded coldly, indicating that he would not talk about topics that he did not understand, and then turn his back and head towards the house. Camila saw how she was going, experiencing an indescribable melancholy. Despite his efforts to appear strong, he perceived a certain fragility in that man. He chose not to continue pressing. However, the dialogue generated a feeling of restlessness inside him. Circe took over that night. In the course of the dinner, Camila got up the courage to address the matter that had been spinning in his head since the morning. Rodrigo enjoyed his dinner in complete silence, as was his custom, concentrated on his plate without turning his gaze away. On the immense table, there was such absolute silence that the slight sound of the blankets clashing was clearly perceived. She asked him carefully if he had ever considered the possibility of being a father, interrupting the tranquility with his question. Rodrigo stopped his task of cutting the meat and raised his gaze little by little towards her. With an intense look, his gray eyes, as cold as metal, landed on her. I will never do it, he answered abruptly. Camila continued to ask, although her voice showed a certain tremor. With an energetic gesture, Rodrigo dropped the fork, causing the sound of the metal to resonate on the surface of the table. It is not possible for me to possess them, he expressed firmly, and in a sharp tone that he was unable to have children. However, when expressing himself, a slight uncertainty took over his thoughts. What would happen if the diagnosis you received years ago was incorrect? He moved his head to put the idea aside. It is absurd. With a firm look, he reflected that this did not alter the situation. Camila kept silent, shocked by the situation. The answer I received was not what I expected. Rodrigo sat in his chair, and for the first time, he observed her with a combination of anger and sadness. Many years ago in my youth, I received a medical diagnosis. I can't be a father, so don't mention the idea of forming a family or vain illusions, since I don't understand them, he added in a more muted tone, but with a hint of bitterness. Camila experienced a feeling of oppression in her throat, not motivated by compassion, but by the melancholy she detected in him. This revelation clarified many aspects: his lack of warmth, the distance he maintained, his indifference to everything related to love or the future. My apologies. She whispered that she didn't know about it. He interrupted her with a reassuring gesture. You don't have to apologize. That's how things are. Firmly, he asked that this matter not be mentioned again before getting up from the table and leaving without finishing dinner. Camila stayed in her seat, alone in that large dining room, perceiving that the wound in Rodrigo's heart was more serious than he had supposed. That night, trying to reconcile the dream, Rodrigo's expressions did not stop echoing in his head. It was incomprehensible to me how a person could endure so much anguish and at the same time erect such impenetrable barriers around him. Despite the difficulties he had faced, he had never stopped believing in the possibility that something positive would happen. Decided not to allow fear or sadness to mark his existence, he committed himself to try to bring a little joy to that home. She would strive to prove to Rodrigo, who was destined to remain in the shadow, that there were still reasons to have faith in the future. The next day, Camila returned to the patio. Despite its reduced size, the roses continued to unfold their flowers. A sweet smile was drawn on her face as she murmured in a low voice, "Patience is necessary to achieve the positive." I did not imagine that his patience and confidence would be so unexpectedly challenged. Days passed in the mansion with the same boring routine. However, something had evolved in the relationship between Rodrigo and Camila after that dialogue. He spoke less frequently, and when expressing himself, his words seemed to be calculated with precision, as if he feared that each comment could reveal more than he wanted to show. For his part, Camila remained silent, although a noticeable change was perceived in his gaze. A serene resolution that began to disturb Rodrigo. That morning, while he was in his studio reviewing documents, he perceived the sound of something sliding outside. Rodrigo frowned with annoyance at the interruption and went out to investigate. In the corridor, Camila was standing, moving with effort a wooden table towards a window of the main hall. He asked her in an annoying tone, "What are you doing?" Camila stopped and gave him a kind look, drying her hands on the apron. "I am going to condition the room to allow the entry of more light. The darkness in this place is so intense that it gives the feeling of being in a grave." Rodrigo replied abruptly, asking who had told him to carry out that action. Nobody responded serenely. "However, if I decide to settle here, I wish it was a welcoming place, and it would be convenient for you to share that desire." Rodrigo's expression reflected astonishment, as if the words he had just heard were incomprehensible to him. It was ridiculous to think of transforming that large house into a habitable place. For him, the place lacked any meaning. It was just an empty and practical area that showed its success. In the end, he indicated that he would leave the table in its place and left for his office. However, Camila did not carry out that action. While he was in charge of closing the door behind her, she continued to change the layout of the furniture. At noon, the curtains were no longer there, and the sunlight flooded the room, revealing corners that had remained in the shadows for a long time. Upon entering, Rodrigo wrinkled his forehead, questioned with his usual tone of command, "Who do you think you are to carry out this action?" Camila replied serenely, "Nobody told me, but if I have to reside in this place, I wish it was a real home." Rodrigo did not respond immediately. He looked around in the room for a few moments, as if the place was unknown to him. The idea arose in his mind that this place could not be considered a home. Without saying a word, he turned around and left. However, that night, as he wandered alone through the residence, the memory of the illuminated room resurfaced in his memory. In the windows, Camila put some pots with small plants and cleaned the dust from the shelves. At the end, the atmosphere emanated a feeling of cozy familiarity. That afternoon, Rodrigo returned to go through the room. Suddenly, he stopped completely when he observed the transformation. The solar rays illuminated the delicate golden elements of the ceiling and the designs of the marble floor that had escaped from his memory. He took a deep breath, as if something of great weight had moved inside him. However, his dignity prevented him from recognizing it. "Do not modify anything else without my authorization," he expressed coldly, without looking at him, while he continued his step. Although Camila did not respond, an expression of happiness was reflected on his face. A few days later, Camila began to place small surprises in the places that Rodrigo often visited. Before leaving for his work, he enjoyed a cup of smoking coffee in his office, where he found a book on the table next to a message. Sometimes, the solutions are found in simple stories, tiny details, but of great importance. At first, Rodrigo did not know anything. The reason why Camila continued to show him so much affection was not clear to him, despite having made it clear that marriage did not matter to him. However, over time, something began to transform. Every time he found a cup of coffee or a message, he experienced a warm feeling in his chest, something he had not felt for a long time. When he returned home before what was expected that night, he discovered it in the kitchen. While cooking, he sang a song softly. The scene was simple, however. Something in it made him stop. From the entrance, he witnessed how Camila gently stirred the contents of the pot, as if cooking was a ritual for her. Suddenly, he broke the silence with a question that took him by surprise. "You always take things with so much tranquility." Surprised, Camila pointed her gaze at him and smiled. He expressed that throughout his life he has learned that laughs do not lead anywhere. "Do you feel like having dinner?" There was a brief lapse of silence by Rodrigo. He never ate dinner at home. For him, food was simply one more task, something he carried out in expensive establishments without experiencing any enjoyment. That particular night, inexplicably, he was at the kitchen table. Camila placed a hot soup in front of him. At first, Rodrigo observed with doubts, but when he tasted the first bite, the simple and cozy flavor evoked memories he had forgotten. When he was little, his mother often cooked soup for him. Everything changed when his family separated, and he had to mature quickly. He questioned while placing the spoon on the plate. "What do you mean?" Camila replied, drying her hands on the apron. "Pretending that everything is in order, that your existence here has a purpose," Rodrigo said, staring at her. Camila inhaled deeply and kept a firm look. He expressed his conviction. "I think everything can improve if one proposes it, even in this situation. You think you are alone because you chose it that way. But in reality, it is not true. What you need is not found outside, Rodrigo, but inside you." The words struck Rodrigo with the force of a stone blow. Never before had anyone had the courage to address him that way for so long. No one had managed to transfer his armor. Suddenly he stood up and left the kitchen in silence, although he did not show anger, but a concern that he could not avoid. While he ordered the table, a sweet smile was drawn on Camila's face. He was aware of Rodrigo's complexity. However, he was clear that, like the roses in the garden, it only required patience and dedication to develop fully. In the mansion, the passage of time became more paused and calm. Despite not recognizing it openly, Rodrigo began to perceive the transformations that Camila's presence was generating in his day-to-day. That lady who walked without making noise and spoke tenderly was getting, without expecting a reward, to occupy the empty spaces that he had chosen not to see for a long time. However, Rodrigo, always being faithful to his personality, preferred to remain reserved, as if he was afraid that showing closeness could make him vulnerable. Meanwhile, Camila continued to show her dedication, patience, and persistence in her work of revitalizing that place. At this moment, the flowers began to sprout in the backyard, while the main room no longer had the gloomy atmosphere of before. However, inside, something began to transform, although he still could not identify it. While he was cleaning the tiny library in the mansion, he experienced an intense pain in the belly. He took his hand to his stomach, trying not to pay attention to the discomfort, and continued with his tasks. However, after a few minutes, the feeling returned, now with a slight dizziness that made her take a seat on one of the sofas. Upon entering suddenly, Rodrigo asked, "What are you doing, Camila?" Although his tone was determined, his frowning left a hint of concern. He raised his eyes with a fake smile and told the man that he was just taking a short break. He experienced a certain feeling of dizziness. Rodrigo looked at her with disapproval and questioned why he did not ask for help from another person to perform that task. "You are no longer part of the staff," he answered, showing more irritation towards himself than towards her, that he would stop acting as if it were. "It is impossible for me to act differently," Camila calmly responded in her tone of voice. Rodrigo looked at her an additional moment before turning around and leaving in silence, without saying a word, although that scene was recorded in his memory. There was something in her that was not common to him. Seeing her with a skin tone clearer than usual, he experienced a new and uncontrollable anxiety for the first time. "Show yourself attentive to her." In the days that followed, the episodes of imbalance increased frequently. Camila tried to hide them, but Rodrigo began to notice. While he was setting up some vases in the room one afternoon, he felt an intense discomfort that forced her to lean against the wall to stand up. At that precise moment, Rodrigo made his entrance. "Camila!" he shouted as he approached quickly. "I feel good, sir. Alone." He tried to answer, although his voice trembled. "No, you are not well," he responded firmly. "Let's go to the doctor right away." Despite wanting to resist, Camila was forced to give in to the determination with which Rodrigo spoke. For the first time since they got married, he assumed command for a legitimate cause. After taking her in his vehicle to the nearest clinic, he did not say a word during the journey. Meanwhile, outside, Rodrigo waited nervously, standing and with his hands in his pockets, while the doctor examined Camila calmly. Despite his lack of understanding of the reason, the possibility that something would happen to her generated great concern. After a few minutes, the doctor left the consultation with a cordial smile. He invited Mr. Torres to enter. Upon entering decisively, Rodrigo interlocked his arms and observed Camila, who was on the bed with a dubious gesture. With seriousness, Rodrigo inquired the doctor about the situation. The doctor assured him that he should not worry. "His wife's health is excellent." The doctor began with a brief interruption, however. "He is in gestation." At that moment, the world seemed to freeze. The words resonated in Rodrigo's mind without ceasing, like an infinite echo. He observed Camila, who had her eyes down, with her hands together on her lap. "It can't be," muttered the disbeliever. "It is impossible." The doctor answered calmly that he had not made any mistake. "The exams are presented in a comprehensible way. It has around 8 weeks of gestation." "Congratulations." Rodrigo experienced a feeling of shortness of breath. He left the consultation in complete silence, walking the corridor with the feeling of carrying an invisible load on his shoulders. Camila witnessed his departure, experiencing the feeling that the world crumbled around him. Although the news deeply impacted him, he could not understand the reason for his incapacity to feel joy. The return to home took place in complete silence. While Rodrigo kept his eyes fixed on the road with a serious gesture, Camila observed through the window, struggling not to shed tears. Upon arriving at the residence, Rodrigo got out of the vehicle and entered without waiting for her. Climbing the stairs, he suddenly closed the door of his office. He stood at the entrance, wrapping himself in an embrace while the shadows of the afternoon spread. The silence in the house, which on numerous occasions had caused him feelings of insignificance, was now unbearable. Paused, he headed towards his room and took a seat in the living room. He placed a hand on his abdomen, experiencing a combination of fear and affection. With a faint whisper, he expressed words of consolation addressed to the being that was developing inside him. At the opposite end of the house, Rodrigo remained erect next to the window of his study. While observing the horizon, his thought wandered far. It was difficult for me to understand it. For a long time, Rodrigo had firmly believed that he could not have children, that he was unable to be a father. How could it be feasible if it did not belong to him? Uncertainty began to invade his being, poisoning his mind and soul. With his jaw tightened, he whispered a resounding, "No. What is happening cannot be true." That night, a silence reigned in the mansion that hid the beginning of a storm. The first rays of the sun barely reached to illuminate the great house. However, the atmosphere of the day was impregnated with a tense atmosphere. Rodrigo had remained in his office all night, unable to conciliate sleep, overwhelmed by thoughts that tormented him. The doctor's words resonated in his mind. He is in gestational state. Instead of causing happiness, that news generated uncertainty and anger. For a long time, he had firmly believed in his inability to have children, thinking that he could never be a father. At that moment, unexpectedly, Camila was in the sweet weight of a baby. He could not understand it, and it was also impossible for him to have the increase of suspicion in his mind. On the other hand, when he woke up, Camila's eyes were swollen because of his tears. It was evident to her that Rodrigo did not trust the miracle they had received, and this caused him more pain than anything else. Since his return from the clinic, he had not uttered a single word. At that moment, as he was preparing breakfast in complete silence, he perceived how his safe steps resounded when he went down the stairs. In the kitchen, Rodrigo appeared with a serious and notorious bag under his eyes. Lying on the threshold, he crossed his arms and watched her intently. With a cold tone, he expressed his desire to clarify the situation. He looked at the person in front of her with an expression of bewilderment, holding a cup of coffee. "What do you want me to explain to you?" "Do not make fun of me, Camila," he answered firmly. "That child cannot be of my descendants." The cup vibrated gently in Camila's hands before she placed it on the table. The beat of his heart resounded with such intensity that it seemed about to come out of his chest. Rodrigo asked him in a low voice, trying to control his emotions. "What words have you heard?" he continued, fixing his gray eyes on hers. "Several years ago they gave me a diagnosis. It is impossible for me to conceive to have offspring." "So, could you tell me who the little one is?" The words seemed to physically hit Camila, making her take a step back. The intensity of discomfort in his chest became unbearable. He observed with amazement. His eyes overflowed with tears that he could not stop. "Is that really your opinion about me?" he whispered in a hoarse voice. "How could I disappoint you in that way?" Rodrigo took a long time to give an answer. There was a brief moment of uncertainty. However, his pride and lack of confidence urged him not to give in. His only request was to know the reality. Camila took a step back, perceiving how Rodrigo's words impacted her like a sharp weapon. It was not the first time they questioned his credibility. However, coming from him, the impact was inexplicably painful. In the room that night, he hugged himself and allowed the tears to flow without restrictions. He questioned how to trust someone who did not trust her with a broken heart. "You should know, Rodrigo, that this child is the fruit of our union," he declared in a high tone, breaking his silence for the first time since they met. "I do not know what opinion you have of me, but I would never betray you." In Rodrigo, a mixture of anger and disorientation took over his interior. He wanted to trust him, but it was impossible to avoid the years of convictions that at that moment were crumbling. He left the kitchen without uttering a word, leaving Camila alone, and her face bathed in tears. Ready and finished. A little later, Rodrigo was in the consultation of his lifelong doctor. He had made the decision that he required answers, with evidence that could confirm or refute everything. The doctor, an elderly man with circular glasses and speaks calmly, observed him seriously when reviewing the previous diagnosis. "Rodrigo, I understand your bewilderment, however. Let me illustrate something," the doctor expressed with serenity. It is possible that the diagnosis they gave you several years ago was incorrect. Not all tests are conclusive. The human body experiences transformations, and the reproductive capacity is not something definitive. Rodrigo showed surprise on his face. He expressed his amazement when asking if it really was feasible. The affirmative answer confirmed his doubts. The doctor expressed that, although unusual, it was not impossible. In case your partner is expecting a baby, it is very likely that it is of your offspring. Rodrigo kept silent, perceiving how the tension in his chest faded little by little, being replaced by an indescribable feeling. Was it a feeling of relief? He did not know that fact. At that moment, all he could understand was that he had made a serious mistake when questioning Camila. Finally, he expressed his desire to undergo more tests. It is important to make sure, without a doubt, but I would recommend that you have a conversation with her. The doctor stated with determination that, although the exams can provide the desired information, the connection with the patient is not based on documents. Upon returning to the big house, a feeling of discomfort invaded Rodrigo, something that he had never felt before. He went to Camila's room and saw her sitting in bed, with her hands on her belly and her eyes fixed on the floor. When he saw him enter, he barely raised his gaze. He whispered Camila's name, trying to find the right words. She questioned in a low voice if she would point it out again, avoiding his direct gaze. Taking a deep breath, Rodrigo experienced how guilt oppressed him. After so long, he was speechless. He approached calmly and sat next to her in bed. Finally, he whispered softly, "I apologize, my Ecuador. It was a mistake to question your word." Camila did not respond immediately. While her tears fell in silence, her hands continued to caress her abdomen. "The little one is not responsible for your fears, Rodrigo," the woman murmured. "If you don't want it, I'll take care of him without help." The words penetrated deep into Rodrigo's being, causing him a deep emotional impact. He initially observed Camila's abdomen and visualized, although only for a moment, the existence that was developing in that place. That child was his own son. "There were no uncertainties. You are not alone, Camila," he answered with an uncertain voice. "I assure you." Camila watched him with tears in her eyes, doubting if she could trust him. However, hearing those words full of emotion from a man who finally dared to open his heart, he perceived a light of hope. At that moment, they realized that that surprising revelation was a possibility to restore what the circumstances and suffering had damaged. The days after that dialogue had a different character. Despite his lack of skill, Rodrigo began to try to get closer to Camila. The distant attitude that he used to show towards her turned into a more peaceful silence, without the same burden of resentment. However, despite being ready to forgive, Camila could not eliminate the suffering so quickly. The wound remained unclosed, and every time Rodrigo looked at her or tried to get closer, she relived the cruel doubt he had had about her. That morning, Rodrigo left his office before he got used to it and saw her in the garden, kneeling among the flowers that he had taken care of with so much care. The rays of the sun highlighted the hairstyle collected in a braid, while his modest outfit waved delicately with the breeze. The image left him momentarily speechless. Camila's tranquility contrasted with the storm that Rodrigo had unleashed, which caused a feeling of guilt in him. With a sweet voice, he approached Camila and told her. He raised his eyes without uttering a word. He showed calm on his face, but at the same time a certain coldness, as if he were protecting the last thing of his being that he had not yet shared. Kneeling by his side, Rodrigo took her by surprise. To observe a man like him, with his perfect suit and his always proud attitude, kneeling on the ground, was a scene I never had foreseen. Lately, I have been thinking a lot, he continued, staring at her. What I expressed and what I carried out are unforgivable. I made a silly mistake. In silence, Camilla put aside a dry leaf that was among the flowers. He expressed that he does not expect to be forgiven immediately, but wants him to know that he is ready to make changes. I want to improve for you and for the little one. Camilla stopped her work and looked him directly in the eyes. After several days, she noticed a change in Rodrigo. The individual who had embarrassed her was not arrogant, but rather vulnerable, showing courage to confront his own fears. With a soft but determined voice, she questioned him. Why now, Rodrigo? Why is it relevant to you? Rodrigo bowed his head and rubbed his neck, trying to find the right words. He expressed sincerely, I'm tired of living in the shadows. I always thought it was preferable to be alone, that it did not require the company of anyone. However, you were the one who lit up this home, and I didn't even realize how much light was necessary. The words resonated in Camilla's heart, although she resisted giving up so soon. He expressed firmly and delicately, Rodrigo, words are simple. What I really need are done. It is not enough to express it. It is necessary to highlight it. Rodrigo agreed, showing his willingness to face the test. He was aware of the difficulty that it implied to regain his confidence. However, for the first time in a long time, he was determined to make the attempt. In the days that followed, Rodrigo experienced a gradual transformation. He stopped working at night in his office. Returning before the workday, he tried to find reasons to be close to Camilla. Sometimes, he looked at her from a distance while he took care of the garden, and on other occasions, he was encouraged to collaborate with her in minor tasks. Despite his lack of skill in simple activities such as holding a shovel, he managed to pull shy smiles from Camilla. On one occasion, he confessed, I had never done manual work before in my life, while I was trying to prune a plant, and ended up breaking a branch. A little laugh escaped Camilla. It is evident. However, Rodrigo, no one comes into the world with all the knowledge. The fundamental thing is to make the attempt. That smile, although fleeting, represented a small achievement in his life. Every time Camilla made a gesture or showed a quick smile, he was one step closer to his goal. One day, Rodrigo arrived with an unexpected novelty. He found it in the living room, where he was sitting and making a tiny white vase that he had started to decorate with stitches. With some anxiety, Rodrigo extracted a tiny package wrapped in simple paper and offered it to her with these words, "This gift is for you." Camilla watched with suspicion while she took the box and opened it gently. Inside were some tender wool baby shoes, handmade, in a delicate yellow color. When he touched them, his fingers shuddered. Rodrigo mentioned in a low voice that he was the one who commissioned them. I understand that I cannot solve everything with gifts, but I wanted you to know that I am beginning to understand the importance of this situation. Tears sprang in Camilla's eyes, but this time they were not the product of sadness. Tears sprang of emotion and relief. Although Rodrigo did not meet all her expectations, little by little, he was approaching an unknown destination for him. With gratitude, he whispered a thank you as he hugged the tiny shoes next to his heart. With a faint smile on his face, Rodrigo settled in the seat in front of her. After several weeks, the shared silence was no longer embarrassing. He, in a soft tone, asked her if she believed that at some point he could be forgiven. Camilla looked at Rodrigo with affection and sighed, explaining that forgiveness is not immediately granted. If you continue that way, it may happen. Rodrigo agreed with what they told him. For the time being, that was all necessary. While returning to his sewing workshop, Camila left him there, being silently observed by him. He had never considered the possibility of being a father or of forming a home. But at that moment, he experienced an unexpected emotion. Rodrigo Torres began to feel that, for the first time, he could have a new opportunity in his life, and he was determined not to waste it. The arrival of winter was noticed in the city, enveloping the house in a more intense silence. Through the old windows, the cold air flowed, while the passage of time seemed to slow down, as if existence itself awaited a crucial moment. However, inside the house, everything began to transform. Little by little, Rodrigo began to abandon the manly figure that he had been for a long time. The mornings, formerly characterized by their coldness and loneliness, now passed differently. Rodrigo used to spend time in the kitchen, while Camila took care of the first meal of the day. At first, he used to observe in silence from the frame of the door, but over time, he began to collaborate, although his poor attempts only made Camila laugh. He asked, while holding a knife with an almost childish clumsiness when trying to cut the bread, "Like this?" She, in laughter, answered him, "If you continue like this, you will not have fingers when the baby is born." After a long time, the house began to flood with simple moments, small gestures that lightened the atmosphere. Although Camila did not express her forgiveness verbally, her actions revealed that something inside her began to heal. Rodrigo perceived the situation, and, despite not mentioning it, he experienced the feeling of being moving in the right direction. Upon arriving at the mansion, Rodrigo brought with him a surprise that he had been preparing for several days. After talking to an old acquaintance, he decided to hire a team of carpentry experts to condition a tiny space inside the house. As he entered the corridor that led to the old winery, Camila perceived something unusual. The door was in between open, and sounds were heard from the inside. With caution, he continued on, and suddenly stopped when he witnessed what was happening. Rodrigo was in the place, supervising the workers who assembled the new furniture and painted the walls with a soft blue tone. With surprise, Camila asked what it was. Rodrigo turned around with his hands in his pockets and a nervous expression, almost innocent. "It's the baby's room," he replied. "I decided it was the right time to start organizing it." Tears flooded Camila's eyes without being able to contain them. He moved cautiously until he reached one of the walls that had just been painted. He found the aroma of the newly applied paint almost fantastic. Rodrigo, who once pointed it out of disloyalty, was now there, conditioning a place for the son whose existence he had rejected. With a whisper, she turned to face him and asked, "Were you the one who did this?" "Nothing more than a part." He commented that he had only thought about it while scratching the back of his head with an uncomfortable gesture. He wanted to have this space prepared for the arrival of the baby. A weak smile was drawn on Camila's face, while a tear ran down her cheek. He expressed his gratitude in a whisper, with a voice full of emotion. Rodrigo approached cautiously, as if he were afraid to scare her. He mentioned seriously that he was aware that you had not yet forgiven him, but he claimed to be ready to do everything necessary in order to regain your trust. "I still can't understand this, boy. However, I have the desire to acquire knowledge. I want to become an exemplary father." When he observed Camila closely, for the first time he perceived in his look sincerity, remorse, and a true desire for transformation. It was not the cold and distant individual he had previously found. It was a person who, like her, had begun to develop with dedication and patience. Rodrigo muttered with emotion, "It is usual to make mistakes, but the crucial thing lies in our subsequent actions." Rodrigo calmed down. At that moment, he approached a little more and with an unprecedented delicacy, he held Camilla's hand between his own. She did not withdraw it. That little gesture, although small, had a great meaning, indicating that the separation between them was shortening. During the days that followed, the work did not give a truce. Although he was not very direct with his hands, Rodrigo collaborated in all aspects of the decoration of the baby's room. The shelves were painted in company, small toys were organized, and curtains were selected with a modest design. Despite not expressing it openly, Camilla experienced a feeling of tranquility inside. At the end of the construction of the room, Rodrigo stopped at the entrance and contemplated the result achieved. The place radiated warmth and vitality. In a corner, he waited for a white crib for his tiny owner, and on the walls, small paintings with messages about love and family embellished the room. Rodrigo muttered, crossing his arms, "I can't believe I participated in this." Camilla, smiling, answered, "You didn't do it alone," while fixing a blanket in the crib. For a moment, Rodrigo looked at her in silence. Camilla's serenity was evident, conveying a feeling of calm that attracted him to her without being able to resist. With a peaceful voice, he stopped next to her and thanked her for not abandoning him. With a surprise on his face, Camilla looked at him. It was soon the moment when Rodrigo's possible transformation in an individual who, at last, was ready to accept what life had in store for him. "It is not easy to give up who you long to change," she answered, frowning a slight smile. "Maybe you're not ready yet to forgive you, but I've already started doing it." Rodrigo's heart, which had been so hard for a long time, began to soften slightly. He placed a hand on his chest, as if he were being propelled to inhale more intensely. He experienced a new feeling of not feeling fear for his emotions. Before uttering a word, Rodrigo took a deep breath. Despite feeling a deep fear of the idea of becoming a father, something inside him, a feeling forgotten for a long time, motivated him to take the step. He doubted his preparation, but he committed to being up to the child and Camilla. He decided to be the father that the little one deserved. Assuring that he would not defraud again, Camilla sighed sadly, allowing a lonely tear to run down her face. "He is aware that it will not be easy, right?" he whispered, although a spark of optimism. It is the motivation it required. In that residence, formerly known for its lack of warmth, reconciliation spread through all the corners, thanks to the arrival of a new family that was just beginning to form. The advance of winter was evident, and the house, formerly cold and quiet, showed a renewed appearance. Every corner and every room looked with a rejuvenated atmosphere. Rodrigo dedicated more hours to being at home, neglecting the image of an indisputable man that he had maintained so much. During the nights, while Camilla worked in the making of tiny clothes for the baby, he remained by his side in complete silence. Frequently, from his seat, and with a cup of coffee in his hands, Rodrigo felt full of nerves and optimism when the birth of the baby approached. He had never considered the possibility of being a father, not even of being responsible for another individual. But when he observed Camilla with his unbreakable calm, something inside him assured him that he had the ability to do it. One night, he interrupted the silence by asking if you were afraid. When he looked up, Rodrigo frowned, as if the question had taken him unawares. He expressed sincerely, "I am not sure. Sometimes I am afraid not to be prepared to face the challenges and make mistakes." While he continued with his work of weaving, Camilla showed a sweet smile. No one comes to the world with the knowledge of how to be a good father. Rodrigo, knowledge is acquired with experience and affection. He sat in silence, allowing his words to have a significant impact. He did not grow up in a loving family environment. He was not familiar with the idea of family. However, being with Camila, he began to think that perhaps that situation could change. At dawn, Camila woke up feeling a sharp discomfort in the abdomen. He sat calmly in bed, inhaling deeply, when suddenly the contractions became stronger. Rodrigo woke up to hear the soft moans as he slept on the sofa next to the entrance. He asked the moment what was happening, showing a face full of concern. "It is the moment, Rodrigo," she expressed with a hoarse voice, firmly grasping his hand. Panic took over Rodrigo's chest. However, he acted promptly. He collaborated so that Camila stood up. He took the coat he had prepared in advance and gently led it towards the vehicle. Despite the intensity of the early morning cold, Rodrigo barely perceived it. The only thing he thought was to reach the medical center without delay. During the trip, Camila's contractions intensified. While inhaling intensely, she held her hand firmly. "Camila, take a breath." She repeated over and over again that we were close, more to calm her own nerves than hers. Upon arriving at the hospital, Rodrigo led her to the room where he would give birth. At that moment, the impotence I experienced was unprecedented. Watching Camila face the most difficult and complicated moment of her existence, he assured her in a low voice that he would not leave her alone. Holding his hand while the medical staff was about to start the necessary procedures, "I will stay here." With tears in her eyes, Camila directed her gaze towards Rodrigo and expressed her confidence with an affirmative gesture. The words came to him in a way that I did not expect. For a long time, he was immersed in an environment in which no one placed their trust in him, except in commercial and financial matters. However, in that moment of extreme fragility, a person entrusted him with the most precious thing, the existence of a being to come. The process of giving birth extended for a prolonged period and was full of pain. Rodrigo remained in the corridor, walking from one side to the other with his hands in his pockets, unable to be calm. Every time he heard Camila's footsteps in the room, he felt how impotence made him squeeze his fists. He experienced for the first time that money and power, along with everything he had achieved in his existence, lacked value if he could not guarantee the safety of those he truly wanted. After a long period of time that seemed endless, a nurse came out and called Mr. Torres to come in. Rodrigo remained motionless for a moment, as if he had to assimilate those expressions. Then he quickly went to the room. What he witnessed left him speechless. Camila rested on the bed, exhausted, but showing a slight smile on her face. In her arms, covered with a white blanket, was her little one. Rodrigo stood at a short distance, indecisive about his reaction. With a tired voice, she called him, "Come closer, Rodrigo. Meet your son." With caution, Rodrigo approached little by little, as if he were afraid to disturb the delicate scene he had before his eyes. With delicacy, Camila raised the little one and approached him. With trembling hands, Rodrigo held the object, perceiving a feeling of overwhelming lightness in his arms. He observed the tiny face of the child, who was resting quietly, and he perceived that something was breaking inside him. It was his scab. "Your son, is it small?" he whispered with a knot in his throat that prevented him from articulating words. "That's right, but resistant," Camila replied, watching them with affection, like his father. Rodrigo raised his eyes to her, showing amazement on his face. He experienced for the first time that someone was watching him with authenticity. He was not an ideal man or a wealthy magnate, but someone capable of giving and receiving love. He whispered a thank you while looking at the child again, grateful for receiving something he never thought he deserved. A slight smile was drawn on Camila's face, while it seemed to leave behind pain, uncertainty, and resentment that tormented her. After a long time immersed in his fears, Rodrigo finally found clarity when embracing his son and receiving Camila's limitless love. At that moment, Rodrigo Torres realized that happiness did not require perfection. Simply being there, showing love to your loved ones, and taking care of what life had given you was enough. With determination, he said, he committed me to being an exemplary father. While watching the baby sleep, I will always be there for you. In the hospital room, with the arrival of the new day through the window, the existence of Rodrigo had experienced an eternal transformation. The arrival of his son had not only granted him a family, but also represented the beginning of a new stage in his life. After the birth of the baby, the dynamics in the mansion changed radically in the following days. The corridors resonated with the delicate cry of the newborn baby, thus breaking the long silence that had reigned for a long time. Despite feeling exhausted, Camila could not hide the joy that invaded her when holding the child in her arms, feeding him or rolling him until he fell asleep. Before, his existence was characterized by effort and lack of certainty, but now he found a more significant reason. In contrast, Rodrigo stood out for being a unique individual. From the moment he had his son in his arms for the first time, something transformed inside him. He decided to put aside the image of an invulnerable businessman and began to show vulnerabilities that he had never explored. At night, he dedicated my time to collaborating with Camila in caring for the baby, learning to hold it correctly, to reassure him in his moments of crying, and to integrate me into that small but full of love family that they had formed together. While the child was resting in his bed, Rodrigo was in the main room, reviewing work documents. Upon entering the room, Camila was holding a cup of tea in her hands and briefly contemplated it before taking a seat in front of him. In a peaceful way, Rodrigo caught his eye. When he called him, he raised his eyes and put aside the documents. "What happens?" She took a sip of her infusion to calm down before speaking. "I wanted to express something important to you. I recognize that last year was complicated for both. However, it is important for me that you know how much I appreciate your actions." Rodrigo observed her in silence, allowing her words to flood him. "I recognize that I have failed," Camila said with honesty, "and I understand that I cannot undo what happened. But I want you to be clear that I do not regret anything we have built together." Camila showed a warm smile, which had always been her greatest virtue. After that moment, a pleasant silence reigned, full of complicity. For the first time, the two experienced the feeling of being in tune, not only in terms of physical location, but also on an emotional level. The birth of the child did not go unnoticed among Rodrigo's social relations. The friends who used to laugh at his relationship with Camila now began to feel interest. Some went to see him, others sent him gifts, and some tried to restore the connection they had neglected. Rodrigo, on the other hand, had changed and was no longer the person who needed the approval of others. In the afternoon, he decided to call a few of his former colleagues to a meeting in his residence. Despite feeling nervous, Camila agreed to attend, aware of the importance she had for Rodrigo to exhibit his new identity to everyone. When the visitors arrived, the house was full of excitement. Camila wore a discreet blue dress, but refined, holding the baby in her arms, with Rodrigo by her side. They started talking about usual work issues, but then they focused on the family they had built. One of his colleagues expressed with a friendly smile, "I never thought I would see you this way, Rodrigo." Watching Rodrigo, A sincere smile was drawn on his face, something that had not happened for a long time. He replied with determination that yes, since he had finally understood the truly relevant. Camila contemplated with satisfaction what was happening. Rodrigo no longer showed the distant and cold attitude he used to have. At that moment, he was ready to reveal his fragility, recognizing that his real success did not reside in his entrepreneurship or his wealth, but in the family he had built. At the end of the evening, when the visitors left, Rodrigo and Camila settled one next to the other in the courtyard. The little one rested quietly on his crib, while the soft breeze transmitted an atmosphere of serenity. Camila, interrupting the stillness, asked if she remembered her desire to turn the house into a real home. With her eyes fixed on the firmament, Rodrigo sighed. "I still have a fresh memory. I never thought it was feasible." Immediately, she continued to hold her hand. "Observe what we have achieved." Rodrigo gave a soft squeeze to his hand. "Without your help, Camila would not have been able to achieve it." He showed a smile, but he kept silent. It was not necessary. The two were fully aware that the journey had not been easy, but they were sure that it had been rewarding. "Tell me that." In the following days, Rodrigo made a choice that would totally transform the course of his existence. He decided to leave behind some of the most demanding jobs that kept him away from his home and shared part of his tasks with others. He chose to dedicate his time instead of his wealth for the first time. Returning one afternoon before usual, he discovered Camila in the courtyard, with the little one in her arms, surrounded by the flowers, to which he had dedicated so much effort. He paused to contemplate what was happening. In that place were his spouse and his son, two individuals who had changed their existence in unimaginable ways. Camila was worried to see Rodrigo immersed in his thoughts and asked him if everything was all right. "All right," he replied as he approached to take a seat next to her. "I am in the exact place I wanted." Camila showed a smile and laid her head on his shoulder while caressing her son's head. She asked what would be your next step. "I will do everything possible to guarantee their protection. True success for me does not lie in my endeavors, but in my family." On that starry night, and with the winter breeze caressing them, Rodrigo realized that he had finally found what he so longed for: a meaning, a motivation to start every morning. He was no longer the obsessed individual with triumph, but he became a person dedicated completely to love. In that residence, in that courtyard, he had found, at last, the place where he belonged. What a story, so exciting. True, if the evolution of Rodrigo and Camila also motivated you, remember to like it, share it with your friends, and tell us your opinion about it. We highly value your point of view. Of course, if you are not yet part of our community, we invite you to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so as not to miss future fascinating stories like this. We would like to know the place where you are watching this video. Leave it written in the comments section. We really like to know who follow us in different parts of the planet.